Democratic state lawmakers are looking to increase New York's gun storage laws, which currently require gun owners in homes with minors or where minors are likely to be around to keep their weapons unloaded and securely locked up. A bill passed largely along partisan lines in the final weeks of the legislative session would apply those storage restrictions to all gun owners. It also requires the Hochul administration to report on gun injuries and deaths stemming from a failure to, quote, safely store a firearm. For more on the issue, we're joined by the measure's Senate sponsor, Manhattan Democrat Eric Bottcher. Welcome back to the show, Senator.
Thank you so much.
Well, your bill is named after a teenager who was being bullied and ultimately took his own life using an unsecured handgun. Existing state law already requires guns to be locked up in homes with minors or where minors are expected to have access. So what is it about your gun storage bill that would potentially stop this type of tragedy, maybe where the current law fell short?
What Francesco's law is a universal storage that essentially says every gun, period, needs to be locked up when it's not under the direct control of the owner. The current law says that it's only when a minor is in the home or you think they might have access to the home or if a prohibited person is in the home or may have access to the home. It's too complicated. So the new standard nationally is universal safe storage. And there are states like Oregon, Massachusetts, Hawaii, who have this standard. New York does not have this standard. That's why I'm excited that we passed this bill, and I'm hopeful that Governor Hochul will sign it into law.
Well, you mentioned the idea of it being complicated, and I could see from an enforcement perspective how the existing statute might be difficult to proactively enforce. But because the statute is really something that is only enforced after the fact, why does it make sense or why does it matter to have a more broad, all-encompassing safe storage law?
It's about establishing norms and behavior. Let's just use the seatbelt laws as an example. I remember in the 80s when I was a kid when the seatbelt laws went into effect, and there were people pushing back. I remember a friend of my mother's saying, I'm not wearing a seatbelt. They're not going to get me to wear a seatbelt. But it became a norm. So today, when you get in a car, you put on a seatbelt, and that's about just making it known far and wide that this is the law. And that's the kind of norm that needs to be established with firearms. If you have a firearm, it has to be locked up when you're not using it. And that could be a trigger lock. It could be a case. It's not complicated to keep your firearm locked up. So that's what Francesco's law is establishing that universal state safe storage standard. And when Kathy Hochul signs that bill into law, it'll be the law in New York State, and every gun owner will be informed with no ifs, ands, or buts. You've got to keep your firearm locked up. It's not complicated. And, Francesco's story is just one of many, many examples of a preventable death. If the firearm in Francesco's parents' home had been locked up, he'd still be alive. There's not nearly enough awareness of the importance of keeping your firearms locked up. And that's why I'm so excited to see this legislation signed into law.
But as you just pointed out, in the situation that led to this tragic death, the gun was supposed to be safely stored and should have been out of Francesco's reach. So what is it about the new requirements that will ensure compliance with the law in a way that the previous law didn't ensure compliance? Because the penalty isn't dramatically changing here.
It's about a lack of awareness. I wouldn't be surprised if Francesco's parent didn't even know that it was the law that the firearm be locked up. We need to make it clear, statewide, universally, with no exceptions, that when a gun is not in your direct control, it must be locked up. Not under these conditions or those conditions. It has to be locked up, period. And that's the norms that we need to establish and the behaviors that we have to establish. And Francesco's law will help us do that. People everywhere are going to know if you have a gun, you've got to keep it locked up.
Why would they know that? Because you just pointed out that his parents, Francesco's parents, may not have known about their requirements, and hundreds of bills are going to be signed by the governor this year. So why should there be any expectation that gun owners will be aware of this law if they weren't aware of the previous law?
Because when things are complicated, they're harder to grasp.
Mm.
The more simple you make things, the more likely people are to know them and comply. Current law saying someone under the age of 17 lives in the home or has you have a reasonable expectation that they might gain access to the home. What does that mean? We just have to make it simple for people, and that's what this will do. That's why other states around the country have moved forward with universal safe storage. By the way, responsible gun owners keep their firearms locked up.
One of the points that was brought up, at least during the assembly debate, was the idea that a storage requirement might undermine the idea of a gun being purchased as a self-defense mechanism because it might not be accessible in a timely manner in the event of a home invasion, for example. Is that an acceptable byproduct of your legislation if it became law?
Well, I don't agree with that assumption. A trigger lock, particularly a trigger lock with a fingerprint deactivation, a biometric trigger lock, comes off in a second, and those cost like $40 to $50. But I also think it's important for us to emphasize that a gun is exponentially more likely to kill or injure someone in the home than it is to be used in active self-defense in the home. But the truth of the matter is that it could be unlocked in a matter of seconds in the event that you did need to use it quickly.
Well, I want to turn to the experience of trying to move this bill because it ultimately had broad Democratic support, but didn't come up until that final week of the legislative session after not receiving a vote in 2025. What was the experience like of trying to get this bill on the radar of your colleagues? Did you have to flag this, say, for the working rules group? Do you just run around and try to get into the leader's ear? What was that process like of getting this bill on the agenda?
It was interesting because this, as you know, is my first legislative session, and this was a period of a lot of learning for me on how this unorthodox process works. It's different than the city council in the state where you're a year-round legislature in the city council. You don't have this clock that you're up against to get it done by the end of session. And because of the budget being what it was so late, we had this compressed session. So I, as a new member, had to utilize my political capital, really, and make it clear to both the leader and to my colleagues that this was my top priority, that this is something that was very important to me as a new member, that this get done before the end of the session. We also had Diana Cochran, Francesco's mother, in Albany, and she was in Albany all sessions starting in January. She was in Albany all last session last year when the bill sponsor, Brad Hoylman Siegel, carried the bill. And Diana Cochran was telling her story over and over and over again to lawmakers, senators, assembly members. And one thing that she and I both said to our colleagues was, please don't make Diana Cochran have to come back next year and continue to relive the most difficult moment of her life again and again and again. Let's pass this bill. It's the standard in other states. New York, we're supposed to be a leader when it comes to gun safety. Let's continue to lead on gun safety and let's pass this bill. That's why it came to the floor and it passed with, by the way, 3 Republicans in the state Senate voted for the bill. How cool is that?
Uh, Well, some bills can just be a victim of not enough time, especially if there's an assumption that the bill is going to be debated. Was that something that you were concerned about at all? This idea that, hey, if this gets laid aside and they have to take it up on the controversial calendar and they go 10 rounds with this, their Senate leadership's ultimately going to say, hey, we got other priorities that we can work on. How, if at all, did that come up?
I was ready to debate the bill. I was so prepared to stand on the floor of the Senate and go toe to toe with the Republicans. And in the end, the Republicans in the Senate didn't call it up for a debate. It was the Republicans in the Assembly who called it up for a debate. I think perhaps one of the reasons why is that Diana Cochran was in the chambers. She was in the chambers, and I acknowledged her at the beginning of the session. And I stood up and thanked her for her advocacy. And she received a standing ovation from the legislature, from the state Senate, for turning her tragedy into something that would save lives of others. And, perhaps that played a factor in why the Republicans didn't call up the bill and debate the bill right in front of her. And by the way, when I stood up and said, Francesco's death will not be in vain. This tragedy, because of Diana Cochran's bravery, is going to be turned into action. I also talked about the fact that I'm a survivor of suicide attempts as an adolescent. And Francesco and I are so similar in so many ways. We were young people struggling with our sexuality, coming to terms with it, bullied at school, young people who had lost hope. And also, by the way, young people who had everything going for them on paper, like their whole loving families, whole life ahead of them. The difference between Francesco and me was that I did not have access to an unsecured firearm. And if I did, there's no doubt in my mind that I would have shot myself with that gun. No doubt in my mind. Suicide attempts with a gun are successful over 90% of the time. That's one reason why guns should be locked up so that they're safely secured when they're not under the owner's immediate control.
Well, finally, in order for this bill to become law, it needs to be signed by the governor. And another big difference from the city council experience compared to the legislature is that here in Albany, there are no veto overrides from a practical perspective. And that means really your options here are to get the governor to sign it or to get chapter amendments to the bill. Most likely, maybe that requirement of a report, because this governor does not like signing bills that require reports. What are your next steps to try to get the signature on this? And are you prepared at all for the possibility of having to negotiate chapter amendments?
I don't think she'll veto the bill. I think she'll sign the bill. I think it's such a common sense piece of legislation that's been implemented effectively in other states. So I'm not concerned about her signing the bill. And we'll obviously discuss any concerns they have about the bill. I look forward to doing that. One thing that I'm excited for next year is the bill that I'm carrying with Keith Powers in the Assembly that will require graphic warning signs in gun stores. Not only a written warning about the dangers of bringing a gun in the home, but a graphic, a photograph that drives home the public health messaging. And it's something that I passed in the city council, in the Department of Health and the city council is creating these graphics that will go on gun stores in New York City. And yes, there's like 15 gun stores in New York City, but it was inspired by, it's never been done in the United States. And it was inspired by cigarette packs in other countries that combined the written warning with a graphic warning that, and it could be a photograph of a child reaching into a bedstand and pulling out a toddler pulling a handgun out of a drawer. Anything to get people to think twice before bringing a firearm into their home. So I'm going to be putting a lot of energy behind that next year.
Is there any reason to think that will have a practical impact on people's behaviors? Because it seems like people probably are already aware of the killing capacity of guns.
That's what people say about warnings on cigarette packs. What good's it going to do? People are going to smoke anyway. They already know the dangers. But studies have shown that public health messaging can be effective. And when it comes to firearms, I can't think of a deadlier consumer product that should have a warning at the point of purchase before you bring that product into your home. And that's why firearms should come with warnings. We also know that public health messaging is most effective when there's a visual component. Many studies have shown this. So what we would want to do with my legislation is add a visual component to those written warnings. And if one person walks into a gun store and sees that warning that shows a toddler pulling a handgun out of a drawer and thinks to themselves, you know what? I'm not going to bring a handgun into my home right now. That will make it all worth it. That will make that law worth it, and it'll save lives.
Is the toddler picture, though, the right one to use once your safe storage bill becomes law and that person has to lock that gun up?
Well, the Department of Health will develop the imagery. That's what's happening in New York City right now. The New York City Department of Health, because of the bill I passed in the city council, they are developing their imagery. But yeah, if you have this public health warning imagery combined with Francesco's law that will require all firearms universally to be locked up when they're not under the control of the owner, that will save lives.
Well, we've been speaking with State Senator Eric Bottcher. He is a Manhattan Democrat. Senator, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.